So for our final pre-lunch session, we have a policy discussion and with our panel. So if I can invite the panelists up to the stage, we have Redmond McEvoy from the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine. We have Andrea Lennon from the Department of Transport. We have Jonathan McFerran from the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs, Northern Ireland. And we have Dearbhla Stapleton from the Head of Decarbonising Energy Support Systems with SEAI. And to chair the session again, we'll invite back up Sean Finan. Thank you.
So good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. This is our last session before the lunch break. We're a small bit behind time. We were supposed to break at 1:15, but we'll hopefully get you to lunch by 1:30, which means that we'll accelerate our panel discussion, but hopefully we'll still get through our discussion points. So as Noel said, I'm delighted to be joined today by Redmond from the Department of Agriculture, Jonathan from the department in the north of Ireland. Thank you for coming down, Jonathan, for attending. Dearbhla from SEAI and Andrea from the Department of Transport. And unfortunately, I have apologies from Niamh Hamill, and I received a phone call on Friday, but our conference agenda had been published or printed at that point. And Sean Kinsella, the Principal Officer, wrote to me to say I send my apologies for withdrawing Niamh Hamill from the Evolving Energy Policy panel discussion covering the renewable heat obligation and the Department of Environment, Climate Action and Communications being unavailable on the day. This is due to unforeseen circumstances and during a particularly demanding time for the department, including our work on the design and drafting of the renewable heat obligation scheme. I wish you a successful conference, and I'm sure it will be a great day. I look forward to continuing to collaborate with IrBEA and conference delegates going forward. So in response to that, then I posed a few questions to Sean and Niamh, and they did provide me with written feedback. So I'll provide that information to you maybe in a minute or two. So maybe we start with Redmond, and I know I'd first like to begin by acknowledging, Redmond, your work in terms of the strategy, the biomethane strategy, and indeed the work of the Department of Agriculture, because the reality of the situation is without the work of the Department of Agriculture, we probably wouldn't have a biomethane strategy, and that's down to your own work, that's down to Bill's, and indeed all the team in the Department of Ag. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that, and thank you for all your efforts to date. Could you tell us a bit about your own work maybe, and your own role within the department as an opening?
Yeah, thanks Sean. So I'm the Bioenergy Policy Lead in DAFM. My work focuses on energy efficiency, the deployment of renewable technologies at farm level, and the supply of bioenergy feedstocks as key agricultural contributions to the energy system. So as Sean mentioned, DAFM works on policies and strategies to supply agricultural feedstocks for bioenergy. We do that because we see there's a number of benefits, such as to the circular economy, to the decarbonisation of agriculture. And that's the reason why DAFM really got involved in the biomethane strategy, along with the diversification impact of the strategy. We also then encourage the use of renewables at farm level, and that's seen through our TAM solar grant. And then also more recently, we launched a biomethane capital grant.
Okay, thanks very much, Redmond, for that introduction. So can you just outline to us maybe the main pillars of the strategy? I know that there has been contained within that, there's the capital grant support and also the renewable heat obligation. I know there are some people calling for more ongoing support in terms of market guarantee, but we are where we are now from the perspective of the strategy. It's a very good start in terms of what it outlines. We remain to see whether the supports will be actually utilised, but could you just give us an outline of the main pillars within the strategy and what it's saying?
Yeah, so the strategy was developed on 5 key pillars that we thought were crucial to development of a biomethane sector in Ireland. Sustainability was one, demand was another, economics was another, and policy, enabling policy then to bring them all together. I suppose we went out to the stakeholders in the industry in summer 2023, and we held a public consultation then earlier this year. And the main bottleneck that did come out was finance and economics of biomethane, which was expected. We secured funding of 40 million from REPower EU, for a capital grant for biomethane. Upon publication of the strategy, then we launched an expression of interest for this grant. So the idea to launch an expression of interest was to try and work out what were the best conditions for the grant, but also what was the most effective payment rates, and see how many plants were out there at ready to go status. So we worked in partnership with SEAI, who were helping us to administer the grant. The expression of interest was open for just over 6 weeks, and we got 46 EOIs returned, which was massive and larger than any what we could have expected. We then opened up the application for the grants. One key condition that was in the conditions were that plants had to have full approved planning by the middle of September, and applications were open for any plants that had this plan for new builds, but also for the upgrade of existing AD facilities. So we received 23 applications. Of the 23 applications, we then put together an evaluation committee featuring ourselves, DAFM, DEC, SEAI and Chagas to evaluate the 23, and we approved 18. Letters of offer have been sent out to all 18 applicants, and all have been returned to ourselves, and the full 40 million has been allocated.
Okay. If I could move on, then we'll come back in a second, maybe Redmond, but move on to Jonathan. You're Deputy Director of Green Growth, which is within the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland. So again, do you want to outline, Jonathan, maybe your own role, tell us about the Green Growth piece, and maybe your work from the department perspective?
Thanks, Sean, and it's lovely to get the invite down today. It's a pleasure to be here. Just for context, I'm a farmer's son from County Down, and I've been working in the department in its different forms for over 30 years now. The department is, as Sean said, Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs. So it has a broad remit, and I suppose immediately you can see then agriculture and environment in the same department. So that causes opportunities, causes some challenges as well. I suppose my own role in terms of the Green Growth Strategy, the Green Growth Strategy is an overarching executive strategy. So it's not one that just belongs to DAERA. It's the whole executive. Hopefully it's going to be agreed in the next month or two by the executive. And what it is, it's really this strategy that puts together the economy, the environment and reducing emissions. So thinking about all our policies, all that we do need to take account of that. We need to reduce our emissions, we need to look after the environment, but we need to think about green jobs, we need to think about the economy. So that's sort of key to that.
Okay. And just Redmond has outlined the main pillars of the Irish biomethane strategy. So I know that Northern Ireland's biomethane journey is fitting within the agricultural policy landscape. So you want to just give us an outline of where you're at from a biomethane perspective and a Northern Ireland perspective?
Yeah, I suppose it was interesting even looking at some of the slides earlier on. In terms of the AD journey, you'll be aware that there may be around about 80 AD plants in the north. That's sort of been static for the last while, driven by rocks. So a lot of farm-based AD plants. CHP producing electricity, but last year I suppose there was a bit of a change in that the first injection into the grid in Dungannon last November 2023. And Department for the Economy are the ones who look after the energy strategy, so I always need to be careful. I'm in another department, but we do work very closely together. So that they went out for a request for information, and there's a real desire and a demand for a move towards producing biomethane. We don't have a target as yet. That's hopefully something that we're going to get over the next while, that we're pushing the Department for the Economy for that. So there are opportunities. I suppose just one thing to tie in with the agriculture side, what we need to do is, you'll be aware that we have serious environmental problems. We're a really intensive agriculture part of the country, 1.9 million people, and we produce enough food in terms of protein for about 10 million. So you can imagine our nutrient management problem is a big one, and the example of that is Lough Neagh, that you'll be again well aware of. And we've too much going into the water. With too much slurry being spread to land, so we need to deal with that. So we're looking at that from a DAERA perspective, from how can we deal with that waste while then producing energy, and biomethane's ideal for that.
And just as a follow-on from that, I know that we have some members that have Northern Ireland facilities, but and we've heard back from some of them that you're running a very interesting project around the sustainable utilisation of livestock manures.
Yeah.
And obviously that could be also directly correlated to digestate having been processed in an AD facility.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that project and the findings of it? Because I think it would be quite interesting to a lot of the AD operators in terms of what you're doing there and the results that you're coming up with.
Yeah, I do get very excited when I talk about this, but I'm conscious we're sitting between you and lunch, so I won't bore you. I might bore you, but I'll bore you in a short time. But in terms of that sustainable utilisation of livestock slurry, what we did, this was a small business research initiative, an R&D project where we went out to the industry, so private sector, public sector working together, and with 6 companies that we appointed, 100,000 each for a proof of concept to see how do we deal with that excess phosphorus. That finished last year, and out of that it was really successful, but we wanted to take that on then to demonstrator level. So our department is putting 12 million then into probably going to be 3 of those companies to develop demonstration plants. And just very quickly, what they're going to be doing is essentially taking slurry, separating that on farm, taking the solid fraction, which would be phosphorus rich as a feedstock for AD, leaving the farmer then with the liquid fraction that would be nitrogen rich, but more easily spread, well, more capacity in slurry tanks and so on. So they'll be able to keep that, but the solid fraction goes to AD. But the important bit is, yeah, that helps the farmer spread less phosphorus on the land, but what about the digestate? So that's where we're taking that as well, and looking at how we're going to do that, process it into a biofertilizer, into biochar, into soil conditioners, with the purpose of removing 1,000 tonnes of excess phosphorus from Northern Ireland per year and exporting that out of the country. And that's the key thing for us. We have a surplus of 6,000 tonnes per year. So our project then will remove 1,000 tonnes of that. So it is a demonstrator plant, but it's to try and show that it can be done, working with the farmers to make that difference.
We wish you success with that, and hopefully there can be learnings that can be taken maybe from a Department of Agriculture perspective around that as well, because I think the nutrient issue is an issue right across the board, and also it's a piece that I know the AD personnel will be interested in as well. If I could move on to Dearbhla, thanks for joining us, Dearbhla, as Head of Decarbonised Heat and System Support at the SEAI. So can you just give us an update on, I know people understand what decarbonised heat is, but what's the system support piece that you're working on?
So thanks very much for having me today. So I suppose it's a relatively new department that's been established just this summer in SEAI, encompassing decarbonised heat and system support, and I suppose recognising the increasing mandate in decarbonised heat, as well as focus that we really need to put on it to meet those targets. We've heard a few different speakers talking about our targets for 2020 haven't been met, and the targets for 2030 that we have now. On the decarbonised heat side of things, it includes our research, our decarbonised heat and bioenergy research programs, as well as a newly established district heat centre of excellence. And then the system support is really, I suppose, there's a number of different support programs in SEAI that help, I suppose, citizens, communities, developers to navigate the supports to really enable the action and the investments that are required. So they include things like the community renewable energy, or renewable electricity support scheme, our sustainable energy communities, the single point of contact for renewable energy consenting, as well as our education program. So it's kind of bringing those all together, really, so we can, like, I suppose we've heard from other speakers how important communities are to the transition, so to make sure that we're bringing them together with a renewed focus.
And you have a team here today? So
we do indeed, yeah. We've a stand down there. We've a team from our SSRH, much maligned SSRH programme, but and also some of our decarbonised heat team are here as well. So if you have any questions,
if anyone wants to engage,
if anyone wants to,
or actually they're there to engage.
Yeah.
Just to follow on, obviously the SEAI heat study was a very important foundational report in terms of our heating sector. that outlined that there was between a 7 and 17% contribution from bioenergy. But more broadly, in terms of the heat study, is there further editions of that coming? Is it going to be updated, or what's?
Absolutely, yeah. So the heat study was published in 2022. It's for those who don't know, it's a comprehensive heating and cooling assessment, which was required of every member state by EU directives. And it really outlined the different scenarios to meeting our net zero by 2050 targets. We looked at for a number of different scenarios, including high electrification, a balanced scenario, and decarbonised gas. So we are actually looking at updating that, but there's a target or a date by the end of 2025. Member states have to do an update of the national heat study. So we're currently scoping out what needs to be updated. So it might be costs, new information that's available. There's a lot of new research going on, particularly in bioenergy, that can inform the studies. So we expect to, we've commenced work on that now this year, and it'll publish at the end of next year.
Okay. Moving on to Andrea. Thanks very much, Andrea, for joining us from the Department of Transport. You're Principal Officer with responsibility for the Climate Adaptation Research and Energy Division. Again, I know your main policy piece is around the renewable transport fuel policy. So can you give us an outline of your work and maybe what that policy says from a bioenergy perspective?
Thanks, Sean, and good afternoon, everyone. So I work in the climate area of the Department of Transport, and as you mentioned, my area covers climate adaptation. We're currently revising the Transport Sectoral Adaptation Plan. It's a statutory requirement every 5 years, so it's quite a big piece of work that we're embarking on. We also have a modest research budget, and that covers research in all climate and sustainability areas across all the transport modes. And then finally, the piece that's of most interest today is the renewable transport fuel policy, the energy part of my role. The policy itself, the current policy spans 2 years from 2023 to 25, so we're almost coming to the end of the current policy, and we'll be embarking on the development of a new policy over the next 2 years. I can go into some of the detail on that policy. Basically, it meets all of our European requirements under the Renewable Energy Directive, and meets the biofuel and other renewable energy parts of the transport measures under the Climate Action Plan. Of course, we've got very ambitious targets under the Climate Action Plan in transport, covering electrification, sustainable mobility, and renewable fuels is one of those targets as well.
And in terms of the blending walls, as part of that, I know E10 was introduced. Is there a scope? Tell us about what the policy says regarding increasing those blending walls further and the different fuels.
Indeed, there's a number of measures in the renewable transport fuel policy. In the main, it sets out the trajectory of renewable transport fuel within fossil fuel and transport, and that trajectory is set every year out to 2030. Over the course of the current policy, we have increased that amount of blending that's required from 13% by volume to 21% by energy this year, and next year it'll be 25% is where we're moving to. In addition to that, we've introduced under this policy an advanced biofuel obligation. That started with a trajectory of 0.3% in 2023, and it will move to 1.5% in 2025. So we're increasing the amounts of blending of those various biofuels and renewable transport fuels in transport use. We also, as you mentioned, introduced a minimum percentage ethanol in petrol, and that was the move towards an E10 in petrol vehicles. We're at around 8.5 at the moment in physical blending, but we anticipate that will move towards the E10 mark. And then we also introduced additional certificates regulations, and that was to incentivise the supply of certain fuels within the RTFO, and that includes biomethane, green hydrogen, HVO and FAME as well. And one of the key elements in the policy that we have currently, which we introduced in 2023, was a system of working groups to kind of implement the measures and to get everybody around the table and how we were going to do this. And in particular, we established an industry expert panel, and IrBEA, of course, attends that. IrBEA has, and its members have been great in terms of the interaction we've had in policy development. You know, sometimes you bring the challenge to us. Yeah.
Weekend talk and various things.
Indeed, but it's always very welcome and always very useful, and you bring that on the ground experience. So they were some of the key things, I think, in the policy at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just speaking of that, those groupings, I know at the last meeting there was quite a bit of discussion about some of the negative press the liquid biofuel sector is receiving, particularly around broader supply chain issues, traceability, sustainability of non-EU sourced liquid biofuel feedstocks, and the potential threat posed by them when they're not traceable and not sustainable. It can be economic, it can be reputational, it can be displacement potentially, and high risk. What's the department's perspective on this, Andrea? And would you be able to tell us maybe a bit more about that?
Yeah, that issue of traceability and sustainability is a real priority focus for us. And in particular, over the past year, we've had a working group established on biofuel sustainability, focusing in on this particular issue. We've heard from a number of speakers, international experts from the EU voluntary schemes, industry experts here, and we're currently engaged in just looking at our own system here in Ireland in terms of the legislative and administrative system to see are there any vulnerabilities there. But of course, as we know, we're all reliant on the European regime, the regulatory regime for ensuring sustainability of biofuels that are coming into Europe. And in particular, as I mentioned, the EU voluntary schemes, the proof of sustainability, and the certification process that goes along with that. And that includes the proof of origin of fuels and feedstocks that are coming from third countries as well. So this is something, and I think you mentioned it earlier, Sean, this is something that always needs to be dealt with at an EU level. And we maintain that position, but we have an ongoing engagement with other member states and with the European Commission, particularly through the Sustainability Committee under the Renewable Energy Directive. So that's an ongoing engagement we have. And also we have our National Oil Reserves Agency, which is the competent authority for ensuring the sustainability of biofuels entering into Ireland through the renewable transport fuel obligation as well.
Okay. And just as a comment, I suppose, on that, while we acknowledge that it's a European piece, I think there's a strong ask that the department and indeed the minister would put a strong focus on this in his interactions at a European level, as that's important, and I think that might be coming in the next week or two. So it's just an important point. So thanks, Andrea, for all those inputs. We have a couple of questions, so I might I think Redmond, you're probably the one that's maybe a number of them are targeted at. I'll throw them at you, and if you can answer them, you can. Yep. If you can, we can get back to the people after. Why was full planning a prerequisite for the expression of interest? Or the grant?
Yeah, so full planning was a prerequisite because, thanks, Sean. There's stringent timelines. The money has to be spent by the end of next year. So the one condition as part of the grant agreement is the plant has to be constructed to an installed capacity by the 31st of the 12th, 2025. So that's why we had to select plants that ready to go start, which had pre-planned.
I know that animal byproducts aren't part of your remit, but there's a question here, or maybe something we need to refer to the animal byproducts group, but is there a move by DAFM to remove requirements for pasteurisation for biomethane plants? So again, probably not part of your remit.
It's not part of my remit, it's a discussion ongoing, but whoever asked the question, I'm happy for them to come up to me and I can take their details.
It's about taking in slurry from multiple plants. We talked about it earlier.
Yep.
The other one is, it's probably more of a comment about, it's an anonymous comment, but it says, as no EPA license will be issued by the end of 2024 for NAD plants, will there be flexibility in the administration of the grants for plants not completed by 2025? So I think you've answered that already.
Yeah, the rules from Europe are very strict on the grant, unfortunately.
Okay.
We will work with applicants, but
you need to talk to you.
Yeah, and talk to us as soon as possible.
There's one there, it came up this morning. Can we please be more specific on the supports the biomethane sector needs? Are renewable obligations enough? Need feed-in tariffs or CFDs, and what they should be? So again, I can answer that in that the industry is really strongly calling for some form of feed-in tariffs or CFDs. I suppose from an industry perspective, renewable obligation scheme won't be enough, probably. But we need more specific support, so I took that one. Can the SRH be simplified, Dearbhla? I don't know. You can talk to Paula, I'm sure, and the team there. Is that the answer to that one?
Yeah. Look, we carried out a scheme review, and we have made a number of recommendations to simplify it, to expand it, and we're waiting for approval to get the go-ahead on that as soon as we do.
What about sustainable aviation fuel from biogas? Again, I don't know if it's something that any of you have any. Andrea, in terms of sustainable aviation fuel
in terms of the next iteration of the policy, that is one of the challenges that we have, is aligning the renewable transport fuel obligation with the new obligations that are coming into play under the aviation refuel regulation and the maritime fuel EU regulation. So it's something that we will be grappling with within the context of the next policy consultation, which we're going to commence this quarter.
Okay, Peter had a comment about why not capture carbon in mosses to re-wet the boglands visible from space. Again, I suggest Peter maybe talk to Board and Mona on that one. Martin had a comment there, how would greater carbon service financial systems help potentially support the cost differential in fossil gas and biomethane? I think the answer is that they would significantly. Does IrBEA or the panel have a view on why the OPEX support barrier is not being tackled from a policy perspective? So, I suppose.
Look, DAFM, I suppose, first of all, DAFM isn't against operational support, but when we were developing the strategy, it was felt that the RHO plus capital support would be the most fast and effective method to get the industry, to kickstart the industry. Energy policy is DEC's responsibility, so I'm not pushing over on DEC, but from 2026 onwards, DEC have agreed that they will launch the next capital support, and that will come from the Infrastructure and Nature Climate Fund. So,
okay. And there's one in, Jonathan, but I don't know if it's within your remit, and feel free to say it's not if it's not. Is there any update on the Northern Ireland solid fuel regulations on domestic wet wood?
Yeah, I'm pleased to say I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't know. So sorry, I can't.
I'm sure you could point us in the direction of someone that can answer. So that's grand. Okay, just to conclude, I'd like to thank our panelists, but before I conclude, I'd just like to read out the responses received from the department regarding questions I posed to them on the renewable obligation scheme, renewable heat obligation scheme, which I imagine a lot of you would be interested in. So, here. Sorry, no. The first question was, I asked, could you outline the steps process involved to the publication of the RHO design to implementation, including the steps in between? So Sean's response to this was, DEC's consultants with support from the SEAI are carrying out the necessary economic analysis that will inform decision points on the RHO, but DEC are responsible for the design and drafting of the scheme. Legal framework drafting is underway in parallel to the high-level scheme finalisation. Both will need ministerial approval for submission to government seeking approval to publish. That was the answer to my first question. The second was, what are the actual timelines that the department is working to regarding the renewable heat obligation from design, publication to implementation? And the answer to that was, as per the Climate Action Plan, the aim for the renewable heat obligation was Q3 2024. This is now slipped, but we are in the last phase for RHO development. This is a critical phase, and we want to make sure we get it right, but are aiming to submit a draft high-level scheme for internal approval soon. The next question, is there going to be a stakeholder consultation on the final design, legal framework, and is EU approval required? As things stand, there is no plan for a final stakeholder consultation. This was covered during the workshops and follow-up sessions during the summer. Following introduction and as a scheme progresses, any future amendments to the RHO would be subject to review and stakeholder consultation ahead of publication. similar to the way the Renewable Transport Fuel Obligation Scheme works. And the final question, is there any relevant information that you would like me to share with attendees on the day regarding the renewable heat obligation, or any assistance, information or data you require from industry or members? And the answer to that question was collaboration with industry to date has been invaluable as part of the RHO development process, particularly during our stakeholder engagement workshops and follow-up calls with consultants. So again, we thank DEC for their feedback, and hopefully that gives you some insights into their work on the renewable heat obligation scheme. So with that, we conclude this panel discussion. I'd like to thank Redmond, Jonathan, Dearbhla and Andrea.